Have you ever sat in class and wondered about the religious background of the professor who was teaching the course? Or have you ever noticed a faculty member wearing a crucifix or a saint's necklace? While visiting a professor in their office, did you happen to notice if they had anything Catholic or Christian around their office? Perhaps you've gotten to know a professor outside of class and faith has just come up in the conversation. You might be thinking, well, does knowing a faculty member's faith background even matter? In some of my upcoming podcasts, I'm going to be interviewing some Catholics on campus who are faculty members to explore their perspectives on living their faith in the workplace. Today, I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Paul Vasquez. He's a faculty member at the College of Coastal Georgia, where he teaches and conducts research in political science, especially related to international relations, as well as American politics and government. His research interests include national and international security, military manpower policy, the politics of military veterans, and the intersection of sports and politics. I met Paul when he taught at the University of Central Florida, and we got to know each other well when we were both involved as co-spiritual advisors for our parish's St. Vincent de Paul chapter. So welcome to the podcast, Paul. You've been involved with higher ed for over 20 years. So to get us started, tell us a little bit about your educational journey and the schools where you've taught over the years.
Hi, Virginia. Thanks for talking to me today. It's a pleasure to spend some time here with you. My educational journey as a student started at the college level, actually going to a private Baptist university here in Georgia, a Mercer University. Then after that, I enlisted in the Army and was in the Army for just under 4 years. Got out, got my master's degree at Ohio State University. And then after that, worked for about a year before finally going back to earn my PhD at University of Notre Dame. So that's where I went as a student. And then teaching wise, while I was still finishing my dissertation at Notre Dame, I started teaching at Wabash College, which was an all male liberal arts college in West Central Indiana, and then moved down to the University of Central Florida in Orlando. And then after being there for 13 years, I came back to my hometown here in Brunswick, Georgia. So my path has gone from the Golden Isles to the Golden Dome. We call this area of Southeast Georgia the Golden Isles. So I've gone from the Golden Isles to the Golden Dome and then back to the Golden Isles as of now. So yeah,
Nice.
that's my path.
Yeah, well, thank you. And
Sure.
have you been Catholic your whole life? What's that been like throughout your educational journey?
Yeah, so I was a baptized Catholic and was actually like my origin story is even an interesting one because if my mom's original plans had worked out, I would have never been born probably because my mom was actually before she met my dad was pursuing a religious community and was a novice but did not go I think obviously to the final vows. Discerned that religious life, I think it was a little too structured for mom, which probably for her at the time was probably disappointing. For me, I'm kind of glad because it worked out for me. But yeah, so I was baptized Catholic here, grew up in South Georgia, and went to parochial school at St. Francis Xavier School here in Brunswick. And have been Catholic all my life, gone to regular Mass attending Catholic and been involved in different things over the time. Altar boy when I was young and things now like St. Vincent de Paul Society, where we work together, and in the choir now. Was in the choir at our old parish and doing that up here. Yeah, and when I was in college, I continued, even though I was at an institution where we didn't have a Newman club or a Newman building on campus, we continued on with my faith and walked about 10 blocks to church and whatnot. And so I've had kind of a different experience, right? Being at an institution that wasn't certainly predominantly Catholic, and then Notre Dame on the other end, and public universities and like Ohio State. So yeah, I've kind of been in a variety of different kinds of settings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. Looking back, were there any times where you had some challenging moments, either personally or professionally, with being Catholic and being on a college campus?
So the most prominent time I could think of with regards to that was in my very first teaching job. It was in an institution where in the first 2 years that I was there, we had first semester freshmen die due to alcohol consumption related issues at a really small institution. And because of some of my background in residence life, which I had developed when I was at Mercer, I became concerned about our ability to provide a healthy kind of environment for the students that were coming in. And especially we were expected to play more of a role in terms of recruiting students and participating in meeting with prospective students and their families. And it was just an environment that I had some reservations about the degree to which we were really doing everything to support our students, both in and out of the classroom, more so out of the classroom. And because of that, I chose to leave that institution and move closer to home because my wife's from Orlando. I had family in Southeast Georgia. And part of that I saw as an extension of being concerned about life issues. Certainly, as Catholics, we probably think most of life issues involving issues of abortion and things like that. But to me, it extends to many other kinds of domains too. And at the time, my wife and I had a daughter, and especially when you have a child and you're thinking about sending them off to school somewhere and wanting to send them to a place where they're going to be safe, kind of nurturing environment. Maybe I was a little more attuned to that because of that experience. But yeah, so that was a tough kind of call to make. And it took a while to make a transition to another institution. It wasn't like I just up and left, but it was tough. But in respect, there were a lot of things we liked about the place, about the people that were there, but it wasn't the best fit for me at the time.
Sure. Well, and I think that's one thing people don't realize necessarily about the university setting is that when you teach a certain subject, you need to go to a different campus if you don't want to. It's not like there's going to be some other place at the university where you could also teach that subject. It's all within the same department and whatnot. So moving is something that faculty tend to do over time.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that was the job I was in was actually a tenure track position.
Mm.
And so stepping away from that and taking a non tenure track position was a big step. It entailed a whole
Oh
lot
yeah.
more teaching, less time for research. But I felt like it was an important thing to do so that I could feel comfortable about the environment I was in and the role I was having in terms of interacting with students and prospective families and trying to attract them to the place I was.
Yeah.
It
Well,
helps to be able to feel comfortable in the place you're at.
sure. Oh, 100%. I want to ask you a few questions about just the political science realm, let's call it. Political science covers so many different topics. What areas have you gravitated to over the years?
Yeah, so as an undergrad, I was a history and poli sci undergrad major at Mercer. And my first interests were international relations, mainly, and history that was more international. Part of that, I think, was like this part of Georgia, the coast of Georgia. There were a number of things. Like the most prominent thing that was interesting was like right here off the coast, like 8 or 9 miles from where I'm sitting, was the southernmost part of the British Empire in North America, at least in the continent. And the Spanish had an outpost down in St. Augustine. And as a young kid, going over and seeing the fort here, Fort Frederica, and learning about the difficulties between the Spanish and the British and all that, even though this was a place that, isn't really a place that most people would think of as being touched by international relations, it was. And as a young kid, amidst all the bicentennial fervor of 1976 when I was in elementary school, it was interesting. And it got me thinking about the wider world. And and then like a few years later, there's the Iran hostage crisis of the late 1970s, which for people who lived through it, that was centrally, it just dominated media coverage. And you had the fate of all the Americans who were in the embassy up in the air. And so that kind of further took me in the direction of being interested in international relations. But just one thing I will say too that your audience might be interested in, since I am at the College of Coastal Georgia and whatnot, is coming up in October of this year, there are 4 Franciscan friars who are due to be beatified, who were probably about 20 miles from where I am now. And this was back in the 1500s. They were serving as missionaries for the faith, and they were all martyred. The local native chief to whom they were interacting with didn't like the idea that he should just be having one wife instead of multiple, and didn't go over well. And yeah, but they are due to be beatified here in the Diocese of Savannah in October. So that'll be an interesting thing. I certainly wasn't as aware of it as a young person. I guess I heard of it a little bit, but yeah. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah. That's interesting because you may also know this is a special Franciscan year. I think it's the 800th anniversary of St. Francis dying. And
Okay.
it's
Hmm.
just last week was announced that this is another kind of called a jubilee year. I'm not sure of the exact term, but a lot of special graces are coming because of this celebration of St. Francis's life. So very
Yeah, that's
cool.
cool. I would just say if anybody in your audience is interested in the fate of those, kind of the archaeology and the history of that, the Diocese of Savannah has done some really good videos that can be found on YouTube. The place where they were was St. Catherine's Island, and so up just a little north of where I am in Brunswick on the coast. So yeah, people could check those out and learn a lot more about their mission hundreds of years ago.
I love that. We'll actually try to put those in the show notes so people can have easy access to them. That's really good. Thank you. So you've woven Catholic thought into your teaching in some interesting ways. I know this from having talked to you in the past. Can you share some examples of how Catholic teachings or Catholic history have shown up in some of your courses?
Course. So one of the classes I taught a lot of at University of Central Florida was a class called Introduction to International Relations. And we'd often have to talk about the differences between idealism and realism. And one of the examples I used to use for a distinction between idealism and realism was actually a gentleman who actually was a Catholic cleric, although the degree to which he was, let's say, consistent with the ideas of love and virtue and all were a little bit questionable. So I was like, I used to bring this little guy here, it's Cardinal Richelieu, who was the chief advisor to Louis XIII of Spain, and he was an interesting guy. He was both a cardinal, but he was also a strategic kind of geopolitical advisor. And his relationship with virtue was probably strained. He said things like, "Give me 6 lines written by the most honest of men, and I'll find a reason to hang him." He said things like, "There is life for individuals in the next world, but there is no future life for France," right? And so France is justified in doing so. It's certainly not governing in accord with religious ideals, but certainly much more power. And he also cultivated relationships with non Catholic regimes and allied against Catholic regimes in some cases. So it just kind of provided a prominent example of kind of somebody deviating from what you might expect based on the teachings of Jesus Christ and things like that. But also talked about in my class on IR theory, one of the things we talked about in that class was just war theory. And I enjoyed doing a lecture where we talked about the origins of just war theory and how it goes back to ancient thinkers and comes up through people like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, who added revisions to it, some thinkers who were at a place called the University of Salamanca in Spain, who further elaborated it and revised it and extended it. And some of that stuff has influenced government policy with regards to things like how you conduct warfare and what's considered to be just and what's not just. And it's actually something I think too few Catholics hear about.
Hmm.
It's certainly got a really elaborate and well developed body of work to it. But I think a lot of times we don't hear as much about it at mass. It's not preached on as much, but I think it's a very rich kind of tradition. And so even though I was at a public university, there was no problem with me teaching that in my class. And I think sometimes people feel a little skittish. I never used my time in the classroom as an opportunity to preach at people or convert people because I was at a public university, and that wasn't what our purpose was. But there was no problem with me bringing in these examples of either people who were religious or these ideas that had been contributed to by well-known Catholic thinkers. And I also covered it. I taught a class on the Vietnam War. The earliest leader of South Vietnam that the United States supported during the late 1950s, early 1960s was a gentleman who was Catholic, but had a very harsh kind of relationship with the Buddhist majority in Vietnam, which arguably made his ability to govern that area very difficult. He had been educated in France and he actually or spent time in a Maryknoll community, I think in New Jersey. But yeah, had a very kind of heavy hand with dealing with the Buddhist community. And I'm not shy about talking about Catholic influence on international relations, but I also don't feel like a need to like whitewash people's responsibility for things. The sister-in-law of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the leader of South Vietnam, at one point there was a Buddhist monk who set himself afire, burned himself to death as a form of political protest. And her response to the media was, well, the next time the Buddhists are having a barbecue, tell me so I can know and bring the gasoline. And,
Jeez.
while I'm not shy about talking about my Catholic faith or things like that, I don't think there's a need to excuse bad behavior or negative things that kind of undermine a leader's ability to lead, because at the end of the day, what's important is what Jesus would have people do. And I don't feel the need to just be a reflexive kind of knee jerk defender of someone just because we have the same religious orientation, right? Because at the bottom of it all is like Jesus and Jesus's teachings, and whether people are authentic and carrying those out or not, regardless of how they represent themselves.
Yeah, there's plenty of examples where leaders have been astray from whatever their religious upbringing might have been, and power tends to corrupt. We know that. I'm really glad to hear that you're including a lot of that, and I'm sure the discussions are really rich with the students.
Well, and I would just, if anybody here is familiar with the history of Vietnam, it wasn't as if part of it was Diem and the period of French colonization had been such that some of the early Catholic missionaries had been killed by Buddhists who were opposed to the intrusion of Westerners in their country. That had happened, I think, almost 100 years earlier or maybe more. So there was a lot of bad blood that had poisoned that relationship. And so I would try to convey that as well, that it wasn't like there wasn't a history there, that it was because the reality is oftentimes making peace between people and finding harmony is not about whitewashing the difficulties, right? There's enough sin and violence and hatred in the world that you don't want to minimize that. And to convey that sometimes people are reacting to these things like DM probably was, but in the long run, that heavy handed approach didn't work.
Sure. Well, I wonder if we could take a step back and maybe have you tell us about your teaching philosophy as it relates to the faith.
Yeah, I try. Well, I guess my philosophy about the way my faith works with my teaching is I've grown to where it's like, and I guess even earlier, it's like I felt drawn to teaching coming right out of undergraduate. And I would have gone on to graduate school, except I didn't get enough attractive financial aid officers to justify it. So I went into the Army for 4 years and then went into teaching. But I felt drawn to it. I felt that was what I was called to do. I learned really early on that I didn't have the skill set that was going to make me a fullback or a linebacker for Notre Dame. My abilities were in public speaking and debate and things like that, and research, and just felt like teaching was the direction I was taking. And truth be told, maybe part of the reason I went back to get my PhD was I felt like there was a really strong draw towards that. One of the things I learned when I was at Notre Dame was that the founder of the Holy Cross Order, a gentleman who is now known as Blessed Basil Moreau, was a Frenchman. He was trained people and was very much kind of an educator himself and developed the CSC along those lines. And he once either wrote or said that he felt like teaching was a vocation from God, because
Mm,
if you knew all the things that different teachers have to deal with in terms of their students, that how else could somebody succeed at a task like that if they didn't have some sort of supernatural help along the way? Like, I think of it that way. It's an opportunity to hopefully plant ideas and ways of thinking, and not just ways of thinking, but like ways of learning, right? It's not just about indoctrination, exposing people to the importance of learning and teaching, reading, and so that they'll hopefully be wiser, better, smarter, and hopefully we'll have a better world in the future because of that. So
So, what advice do you have for students in the educational experience, maybe in your own classroom or just in college in general? The landscape of education is changing over time. So, what advice do you have for them to succeed in college?
I think so. This is one thing I've said. I used to tell my students this, and I wouldn't, when I was at a public university, I didn't, and I wouldn't put a religious spin on this, but you could probably imagine where this would be going. But I often found that students were having trouble if they weren't sufficiently focused, if they had too many different things going on. And I used to tell my students that I think students and I think people are like light. And if light is focused, it can be powerful, right? I mean, that's what a laser is. You can cut through steel with focused light energy. But if it's too diffuse and too divided, you're not going to get that. And that's not to say that people should go to extremes and be obsessive, but at some point you have to make space for the things that are unimportant. And at some point you have to say that there's some things that are unimportant that you have to cut away from. And I had to make the decision to give up being in debate when I was in undergraduate. I had a semester I was spending all kinds of time doing debate research. I loved it. I loved the activity, but I wasn't doing some of the stuff I needed to do for my classes. My GPA suffered. And so I had to step back and really focus myself academically after a pretty weak semester. And I didn't have to. Nobody said you've got to do this, but I felt I can't go on being so distracted. So it's not to say that, like I said, people have to be obsessive about their classwork, but at some point you have to say this is important. I'm going to focus on this, especially while you're a student, for 4 years or 5 years, or hopefully not more than that, if you want to get through and make progress. So that would be the one thing, being focused and being willing to do the work, because unless people have marinated in an area for a long time, a given field, it's hard to really master it. And so it takes time and it takes repeated exposure. And some people catch on quicker than others, but I think for a lot of people, it just takes time and a sense of patience with yourself, but also the humility to say, you know what? I'm not going to get this the first time I hear it. Sometimes students will come to a class and they think they put too many expectations on their ability to learn. Like just hearing it once is going to mean that it's sunk in. And that's not the way it is. The same way, like we as Catholics, we don't go to mass once and kind of like, okay, well, that's done. We don't go to mass once. We don't receive Eucharist once, right? There's that need for reinforcement and to cultivate a mindset, not just habits about rituals, but like a mindset. And so I think the same thing is true about going to class and doing your work. It's going to cultivate and develop a mastery, hopefully, of material. So that would be the bit of advice. Have fun too, right? I mean, have
Yeah.
fun, get some exercise in. I would also say, by the same token, it's important to have balance, because when I was in graduate school for a while there, I got unbalanced and
Mhm.
was not taking care of myself, not getting exercise that I needed to get to burn off stress and energy. And I would say try to have some balance, but while having balance, be focused enough on what you need to do to be successful.
Yeah. I love that. I once had a faculty member, I had a number of classes with him in anthropology, and he sat me down and he says, "You would be such a better student if you quit doing some of your other extracurricular activities." Because I was very distracted at the time, and I wish I would have taken that more to heart at the time. I kind of blew it off, but yeah, you need that feedback every now and then.
I think part of it is like in the United States, I think we get told you can have it all, you can do it all, you can be everything. And I don't think that's really true. At some point, there's some limits, and we have to acknowledge like who we are, where we are, and where our strengths are, and where our weaknesses are, and adjust accordingly rather than thinking we can do it all and don't have to make compromises or sacrifices, right?
Right. 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 Well, I'm wondering too, what advice do you have for students that are interested in political science as a degree right now? A lot of schools are very job focused. And what if a student wants to be a political science major? What would you tell them?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is so the number of jobs out there for a political scientist in academia are really hard to come by. The academic job market is a very difficult one. And people in higher ed are talking about the demographic cliff with fewer people going to school in future years because of declining population. And so, as far as teaching political science in a university setting, those kinds of jobs are probably going to be pretty hard to come by. But people can get degrees in political science at the undergraduate level and do a wide variety of things with those. And especially if it's paired up with a degree like public administration, like that's probably one thing been in a I probably would have been wiser if I'd gotten a master's in public administration along the way. I didn't. I mean, to pair that up with a PhD. But yeah, there are a variety of ways where people can work at the federal, state, local level, city level, community level. I would say find something that you're interested in and you care about, and then find a way in which you can advance or work on that in the public policy realm or the political realm by getting a political science degree. But yeah, I would couple it with at least like a minor in public administration, I think, or something like maybe communication. So another field too is a good thing to pair it up with.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
And for parents or students selecting colleges, what advice would you have for them?
That's a great question. The most important thing is about the fit between the student and the institution. It shouldn't be about mom or dad went so and so, and that's where their child needs to go. My daughter got accepted into a master's program at Notre Dame, where I got my PhD, and she ended up going to Rice University in Houston to get it. I never put pressure on her about you need to go to Notre Dame because that's where I went. She even went to kindergarten and preschool at Notre Dame at the Early Childhood Development Center there. But it's about understanding. I was kind of fortunate. My parents had not graduated from, they didn't earn a 4-year degree. So I didn't have parents who were like, well, you need to go where I went. And they were supportive of education for sure. I mean, they sacrificed to send me and my brother and sister to a parochial school when we didn't have a ton of money laying around. But yeah, it really has to be about what's going to, I think, be good for the student. So, what's a place that's going to be a good fit for them? And I think if parents are just trying to fit kids into a place that makes them happy, then the student is probably going to be unhappy. So, finding a place where they are going to be well supported with student support services on campus, with faculty that are open to listening and interacting with them. One thing I would caution about is really large institutions. They oftentimes have great sports teams and this, that, and the other, but smaller institutions can have a lot going for them. It's a lot easier if you're a young person who really likes to do research and hopes to do that while you're an undergraduate and maybe do that with a faculty member. You're a lot more likely to do that at a smaller institution than you are at a larger institution, because the larger institutions, they usually have armies or rows upon rows of graduate students who already have undergraduate degrees and maybe master's degrees. So there's a lot to be said for attending a smaller institution where you can have more close interaction with faculty.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I have three last questions for you as we wrap up this interview.
Yes.
The first one is, Paul, who is your favorite saint and why?
I would have to only narrow it down to 3. I won't play favorites with the Saints, but yeah, so One that I feel close to is Ignatius Loyola because he was a soldier who suffered an injury and his religious interest kind of came out of that period of recovery. And I suffered from some anxiety and depression after some of my time in the military that took a good number of years to overcome. And during one period in particular, when I was really depressed, I actually was like, I need to get out of myself and I need to start doing some other things. And that was actually when I started working with the St. Vincent de Paul Society in South Bend, and seeing other people in their needs was a helpful thing, along with some other kind of support from the team at Notre Dame. But so that would be one thing. Another thing too is there was a period in my faith where I was verging into scrupulosity, and he had an experience with being scrupulous and was able to overcome that. So Ignatius of Loyola would be the first. The second would be St. Francis of Assisi because of his devotion towards the poor, but also because of his appreciation for the natural world. My way of relaxing is to get outside, go biking, go hiking, go kayaking. And really, when I'm in the natural world and out there, it's like I really feel a close relationship with God and kind of in the creation that's around me. And the third would be St. Vincent de Paul because of his great love and care for the poor. So
Nice.
that would be my response. So
Those are 3 heavy hitters. That's a good list. If
yeah,
you could
I'm
give
sure there are great
one
ones out there too that I haven't mentioned, but those are the ones I feel most akin to.
Yeah, thank you. If
Mhm.
you could give one message to every Catholic college student about staying faithful in college, what would it be?
I would say going to mass regularly, weekly, I think for me was important. Just to, again, like the way I think of it is not so much like the church expects me to do this, but like the same way I feel the need to get out and exercise. And as I've gotten older now, I feel the need to stretch. As I've gotten older and sitting down at work and stuff, I've got to stretch more. Otherwise, I'm going to not be comfortable. Right. And so that same kind of way I feel about like exercise and those kinds of things. I think being a faithful attendee at mass is a way in which you're at least interacting with people around you and not just putting it aside. But by the same token, I think it's important for people to follow their conscience. So I don't think people should be doing that simply because I'm telling them to do it or because their parents might prefer that or grandma or grandpa. And but I do think it's useful. But yeah, I think that's the main thing is just because of what it cultivates in us by participating in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's wonderful advice. So thank you very much.
Sure.
That's all the questions I have for you, Paul. I just appreciate your being here, and this
Yeah.
has been a really great conversation. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. It was fun. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. And just to wrap things up, folks, I'm going to say please remember to like and follow this podcast. I encourage you to continue listening. We have a lot of great interviews scheduled for 2026, and I really look forward to sharing a lot of interesting people with you. So I look forward to seeing you next time and have a great week. Mary, untire of knots, pray for us, and God bless you all.